Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another engine simulator devlog. Two-stroke engines have been heavily requested since the engine simulator prototype was first revealed last year. Well, today we're finally going to simulate a two-stroke engine. But first, I'd like to thank BeamNG, Reyna, Meister, and Joe for supporting me at the Master Mechanic level on Patreon, and Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Squarespace is a great tool for getting a domain and building a professional website. At various points in my career, I was a full-time web developer, so I know the time that web development takes. Squarespace's Fluid engine may not be able to simulate fluids like my Fluid engine, but it does make designing great websites very easy, and I'm even using it for my own company's website. If you need somewhere to start, Squarespace also offers a large variety of flexible website templates for many categories and use cases. After your website is live, you can track page visits and visitor activity through Squarespace's comprehensive analytics features. Head to squarespace.com to start your free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/ontothegreat to save 10% off your first purchase of a domain or website. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Alright, first of all, what is a two-stroke engine? Two-stroke engines use something called a two-stroke cycle, as opposed to the more common four-stroke cycle found in most cars. Two-stroke engines produce a lot of power for their weight, so they're used in applications where you'd want the engine to be as light as possible, like in handheld power tools or dirt bikes. Today we're going to focus on the engine from this Stihl MS461 chainsaw. It's a pretty typical ground saw, weighing in at around 15 pounds. The engine is a 77cc two-stroke, making around 6 horsepower. I measured whatever was easily accessible on the saw without pulling it apart completely, since I'd rather not do that until I actually need to repair something. I do have some older chainsaws that I've rebuilt in the past that we might look at in future videos though. To have some idea in our minds of the sound and performance characteristics of this particular saw, I got some reference footage doing some typical cutting operations. Alright, now that we have the specs and some reference audio, let's see if we can simulate this chainsaw. If you watched my last video, I put together this application that demonstrates my new engine simulation. If you haven't watched this channel before, Engine Simulator is a real-time simulation, and it generates completely synthetic engine audio. Right now, it's configured for 4-stroke engines that use an intake and exhaust valve. My Fluid simulation is completely modular and generic, so it's not limited to this particular configuration. I'm going to make many hours of programming go by in an instant, and we'll skip over to the slightly reconfigured simulation that is set up for 2 strokes. The first difference that is immediately noticeable is the valves are gone. Some 2-stroke engines do use valves in their designs, like reed valves for example, but our reference saw does not. So the way that this works is the intake is actually not connected to the cylinder at all, at least not directly. The intake runner actually leads to the crankcase, so as the piston moves up, it pulls a partial vacuum in the crankcase and draws in intake air. This has the added benefit that the rotating assembly gets coated in oil, which is mixed beforehand into the fuel. To actually get the air and fuel into the cylinder, we come over here to the transfer port. When the piston moves down, the intake port is closed and the air in the crankcase is compressed, forcing it into the transfer tube. When the transfer port is opened, intake air is forced into the cylinder. The exhaust system works in a similar way. On the power stroke, the piston moves downwards, revealing the exhaust port and allowing the exhaust gases to escape. As you can see, by cleverly using the crankcase as an additional air reservoir, the 2-stroke can achieve an entire combustion cycle in a single crankshaft revolution. I didn't need to modify the simulation that much to accommodate these design differences. All we needed was the extra tube for the transfer port and using the piston's position to calculate the flow area of the 3 ports. I've inputted the measurements for the MS461 using the scripting interface that I built last time. I did have to estimate some measurements that I couldn't find or get myself, but it should be reasonably close. The muffler on the saw is a fairly simple device. It's mostly just a large box with a hole in the side. I modeled this very roughly using this inflated tube. This is probably the most questionable part of this simulation since, as I've mentioned before, this is a one-dimensional CFD, and while it can model some changes in cross-sectional area, when it becomes extreme like this, it's debatable whether one-dimensional techniques are even still applicable, since it's more of a three-dimensional problem at that point. But in any case, let's see how it sounds. Clearly, the engine works, but it actually works a bit too well. It even works with the throttle valve completely closed, which is probably not right. It also sounds a bit too perfect. We can randomize the combustion events a little bit to make it a bit more realistic, but it's still not that great. The real issue here is that while the simulation tracks the air pressure, temperature, and velocity in the tubes, it doesn't track what the gases actually are. It assumes that the air-fuel ratio in the cylinder is always ideal, which is just not realistic. To fix this, I needed to update my fluid simulation to track the chemicals that we are interested in, like oxygen, fuel vapor, and carbon dioxide. We can now see that fuel, identified in red, is tracked as it's pumped through the engine and ends up in the exhaust system. The ignition is off in this case, so the fuel doesn't get ignited. The fuel is injected using a theoretically perfect fuel injection system that forces the air-fuel ratio in the intake runner to a particular value. Real engines don't have such a system, but we'll address this later. With this change, the engine at least doesn't run with the throttle plate completely closed, which is good. If we adjust it open slightly, we can see that the saw starts and has a very stable idle. Listening to just the chainsaw engine running on its own is not representative of how we would hear it in real life. To fix this, I also added a bar and chain simulation. The guide bar is a metal plate with a groove in the center that guides the chain, which is what actually does the cutting. The chain is driven by the engine through a sprocket connected to the engine's drive shaft. The sprocket is not directly attached to the crankshaft though, but is instead attached via an automatic clutch mechanism. Specifically, it's a centrifugal clutch, which means that it uses the centrifugal force generated by the spinning crankshaft to generate the friction force needed for the clutch to engage. In this image, you can clearly see the two weights which are held inwards by two springs. At rest and at low speeds, the clutch is therefore disengaged. When the assembly spins faster, the two weights are forced outwards, pressing up against the outer wheel, which couples the engine to the drive sprocket. This is what allows the chainsaw to idle without the chain spinning. The clutch also allows the chain to stop moving or bind without stalling the engine. When a harder material like a knot is encountered, or if the chain gets pinched at some point in a cut and binds, the slipping of the clutch allows the engine to keep running like in this demonstration. The math behind centrifugal clutches is pretty straightforward, and I've simulated each of the components I described earlier in a physically realistic way. Now we can hear the engine when it's actually under load, which is more realistic. I'm using the mouse to modulate the cutting load, and the amount that I'm loading the saw is displayed on this bar on the left. The engine sounds reasonable under load, but the idle doesn't really sound much like a chainsaw. It's clear that the combustion events are happening too consistently, and the simulated saw doesn't have the instability that the real one has at idle. A lot of this likely has to do with misfiring and partial firing at idle, which the simulation doesn't take into consideration. The combustion process actually requires the air-fuel ratio to be in a pretty narrow range in order to happen efficiently and consistently. The combustion process is also sensitive to the presence of exhaust products, which can cause misfires and partial burns. As we can see on these instruments, even with a theoretically perfect fuel injection system, the AFR in the cylinder is definitely not optimal at idle and should actually be in the middle of the gauge. There is also a high concentration of exhaust products, which should cause intermittent misfiring. There is published data about this that we can use to develop a probabilistic model to predict this behavior. And once that's in place, we start hearing the familiar two-stroke idle start to emerge. Our simulation is definitely getting closer to reality now, but it still doesn't sound entirely right. A lot of it is probably because this is just a simulation and it's never going to be quite as good as reality, but I think some of it has to do with the way that fuel is being injected into the engine, which is not really similar to how it's done in a real engine. In older car engines and most two-stroke engines, fuel is added precisely using something called a carburetor. Carburetors can be extremely finicky devices, and I won't lie, I tried to implement a carburetor simulation for this video, and it turns out they are just as annoying to debug in simulation form as they are in real life, and I wasn't that successful. Carburetors are a bit too complicated to discuss in this video, but I will definitely come back to them in a later video when I simulate them in more detail. I did implement a very simple carburetor simulation, which I think does capture some of the complexities of the real engine, but you guys let me know what you think. It's definitely not perfect, but as I've said before, this is a work in progress and it'll continue to improve as I do more research and refine the engine simulation. I didn't want to attempt this with the old fluid simulation from ES2D because Honestly, I didn't think that it was up to the task, and I really wanted to do Two Strokes justice, just because of how iconic they sound. If you want to try out this demo for yourself, it's available to all my supporters on Patreon. Next time, we'll be finalizing the Steam Engine Simulator Power Generation DLC, which is set to release in December. I hope to see you guys there, and thanks for watching.